All right, everyone. Hi, and welcome to our Inclusion and Wellbeing Forum. It is our first one of 2022-23 academic year, so you're very welcome. Let me just share. Oops. Here we go. All right, so our session today is going to look at supporting students, SENCOs, heads of inclusion, principals, vice principals, and everybody on their return to school and to the academic year. So as usual, we would ask that all mics be muted so that speakers can be heard. If you have a question, please do feel free to ask. You can put your hand up or you can ask at the end. We try not to discuss individual cases, particularly with reference to individual students, schools, or families. So please don't mention any names, but do feel free to ask questions in general terms. Please, if you are an industry representative, if you have a store or you're providing a service, please don't advertise on the forum. This forum is all free and accessible to everyone, and we don't necessarily promote any specific products or services. We'll record this session. It will be made available on our YouTube channel. So by participating, you agree to the recording being made available. And please remember that all the presenters on this forum, we are all in the same boat as you in schools. Nobody is a complete expert, and we're all learning. So everybody has some knowledge and expertise to share, and we're always happy to hear other people's opinions and points of view. Whatever we talk about on this forum is purely as an advisory capacity, and we would always advise that you defer to your senior leadership team in your setting or your management in your setting for final advice and final word on best practice, because every school and every centre is slightly different. So while we will give advice, we would always say check with your leadership team before you take any action. Okay, so our key takeaways from this session are all around the beginning of the year and what we need to do to ensure that as an inclusion practitioner, we're really set up well. So we're going to look at time management and self-care. We're going to look at how we can share the load, because particularly in inclusion, we have very high workloads regularly. If you're a head of inclusion particularly, the workload can be quite big, especially at the start of the year, where you have lots of new students, you have new teachers, and everybody thinks straight away a student will have special needs or individual needs if they are struggling to settle or they may have behavioral concerns. We always defer to the head of inclusion. So we're going to look at how we can ensure that load, the burden of care, is shared. We're going to look at getting to know our students, policy review, safeguarding, action planning, step and SIP review, regulatory compliance, allocating students, setting out procedures for the school, setting up your IEPs, setting out your tracking and data management, and staff compliance training and onboarding for newbies. So it's huge amounts that we're going to look at today, but it's just a brief overview so that we know that we're on track and that we're not missing out on anything as we set up for the year ahead. Okay, so first things first, I wanted to talk to you about time management. And this is particularly for heads of inclusion, SENCOs, vice principals, or whoever is your pastoral carer in the school, your counsellor, etc. And looking at how best you use your time. One of the most common concerns that I hear from schools at this time of year is the huge load that we have to deal with, and managing time. How can you prioritize, and how do you know where to spend your time is best? And this little matrix is a very useful tool when you're trying to decide how to use your time. Very often we have 50 to 100 emails coming in every week or every day, even for some schools when you've got a big school. And everyone is demanding attention. And they're all asking us as heads of inclusion or counsellors, can you come to my class? Can you come see this child? Can you come and do this with this group? So it's very difficult sometimes to decide where you should spend your time. So a matrix like this can help you to decide what is really important and where your priorities should be at this time of year. So there are different quadrants that go from urgent and not urgent, and important and not important. And it's useful to take each of those requests or each of those tasks that you have and place it on the matrix and decide, where is the impact of me spending time doing this activity? Is it on solving pressing problems that are not important and have a low impact? Or is it on spending time doing an activity where there will be a high impact and it is important? So a tool like this can help you to really be purposeful in deciding where to spend your time at this time of year. And it's important to understand what things are distractions and what things are not a good use of your time, especially when you have a lot of young or new teachers in your school. They can very often immediately defer to a SEND teacher or a SEND co, asking you for your support for trivial things that may not have a high impact. So it's really important to be able to identify that. And having a tool like this also can help you to justify to your SLT where you have said, okay, I didn't spend my time doing this because I do not feel that the impact was high enough in terms of the amount of time I have and the amount of requests I'm getting. And part of this time management is self-care. And as a counsellor, I hear all the time from teachers and practitioners about how much stress they are under at this time of year. So it's really important to know that your self-care is vitally important as a practitioner. And I often think of the meme that is shared widely about the airplane that is in trouble, it's crashing. And they always say, you've got to put your own oxygen mask on first, because if you don't save yourself, you can't save anybody else who's with you. And it's no different as a practitioner. You've got to be in full functioning order in order to support your teachers and, most importantly, your students. So it's important to be able to ask for help, to take a step back, and to forgive yourself. So if you are saying no to people, that's okay. It's totally fine to say no to people, and using that matrix can be a really supportive tool for you to justify to not only yourself, but to your leadership team that this is where I'm saying I do not need to support. I'm setting my boundaries, and you're perhaps allocating that responsibility to somebody else on your team. So always self-care is really important when you're managing a really large workload. Okay, so what does a student of determination look like? And I'm going to ask you to just think about this for a moment. What does a student of determination look like? And you find that in every setting, a student of determination looks precisely like every other student in most cases. Some students have got visible attributes that will help you to identify them, like perhaps they've got a cochlear implant, or they've got a visibly identifiable barrier like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, or perhaps they've got a wheelchair. So they're visible attributes, but the vast majority of students of determination have no visible attributes, so they look just like everyone else. And then also, equally, what does a SEND teacher look like? You'll often hear teachers in certain settings, they will say, well, I'm not qualified, I'm not a SEND teacher, but in actual fact, every single teacher in your school should be a SEND teacher or an inclusive education teacher. So this is a huge thing to make sure that your staff know that everybody is responsible for students of determination. And this is vitally important when you come to your planning, because your class teacher is the first port of call. Your class teacher is the first person of responsibility for a student of determination. So they are the person through whom all planning should go. They should be responsible for the IEP. They should be responsible for setting up communication with parents. And most importantly, they are responsible for the student of determination learning. They are the number one. A SEND teacher and a head of inclusion, they're secondary, because the class teacher is the person who spends most of their time with the student. They're the person that the student sees most often. So they have to be the central person. So when we come to setting out our tasks for the year ahead, as a SENCO or a head of inclusion, the first port is to get to know your teachers. This is really important. Move around to all of the classes as much as you can. Visit your classes, carry out observations, not just on your students, but on your teachers. Get to know their strengths, get to know their capacity, and ask them questions like, have you any additional qualifications? Have you ever worked with certain students who have specific needs? And you'll find that a lot of teachers will have specific qualifications working with, for example, autism or students who have sensory needs. You may have teachers who are really passionate about supporting students who are more able, gifted, or talented. So getting to know your teachers will help you to identify their key strengths and equally help you to lever their strengths to support your students. And most importantly, get to know your students. So as a SEND teacher and as a head of inclusion or a SEND co, it is vitally important that you take time at this time of year to visit classes. And I would advise that you visit classes without any agenda. Okay, guys, if I could ask you to just mute, thank you. So visit classes without any agenda, and don't wait for teachers to invite you to their classes. Go and visit, especially new teachers or young teachers. Sit in a class with no particular student in mind and just observe. If you take a little time, even if it's only 10 to 15 minutes, to sit in a class, you will find that you will pick up on individual needs, perhaps more quickly than the class teacher would, because they're very busy teaching. A class teacher is so absorbed in trying to ensure that students are making progress, that they're covering their objectives, that their students are paying attention. They may not notice certain needs or barriers to learning that are emerging. Whereas if you're observing silently, you have that time and you have that kind of that quiet and peaceful moment where you can just observe. And sometimes during those observations, that's when individual needs will really become apparent, and you will have the capacity to pick them up where a teacher or a TA may miss them in the hustle and bustle of delivering lessons. Okay, once you've done classroom observations and you are coming to getting your kind of practice set up as an inclusion lead or a SEND teacher, it's important to do a policy review. Now, the UAE has released some new documentation, relatively new documentation over the past couple of years. So it's important that these policies and these initiatives are reflected in your inclusion policy. One of those is the policy to empower people of determination. We have Federal Law number 2 from 2006, protecting people of determination. And each individual regulator will have their own guidelines for inclusive practice. ADEC have guidelines, but those haven't changed for quite a while. KHDA in Dubai have got guidelines that have been updated as late as 2021. And SPIA have got guidelines that were updated probably, I think last year. They've released new guidelines as well. It's worthwhile to note also that a new federal inspection framework should be ratified this year. However, as of now, all of the regulators are still using the existing inspection framework. So we do not have a change as yet. The new CEF documentation that has been released is reflective of the existing framework. So for now, inclusion will still fall under Performance Standard 5. So there's no change at the moment, but we should expect a change. One of the key policies to be hyper aware of as an inclusion department is your safeguarding policy. This has to be fully up to date and should be shared with all teachers, all LSAs, all teaching assistants, and all individual LSAs. So make sure that every member of your staff has seen and read this safeguarding policy. It's important to review that every year and to make sure that all of the laws as stated here are reflected in that policy, and also to ensure that your school has a designated safeguarding lead. Now, there are different names for that. So most of the UK would call it a designated safeguarding lead. Australian curriculum, for example, would call it a designated child protection officer. So use whatever terminology is associated with the curriculum that your school practices. It is valuable to have safeguarding leads photographs clearly visible throughout the school so that students and staff know who they can go to discuss any concerns that they may have, or to talk about any experiences that they're having, and that those safeguarding leads are always available, that at all times at least one person is available in the school. It's important also to note who takes care of critical cases. So if you have any profound needs or students who may have an emergency case that needs to have the attention of the authorities, who is the person who will bring that case to the authorities? So there should be one appointed person in the school, whether that is your principal or your DSL, designated safeguarding lead. That person needs to be always available, and the kind of the practice of reporting should be clearly laid out in your safeguarding policy. Okay, as a head of inclusion or a SEND teacher, you should ensure that your inclusion action plan is up to date and reviewed. So every inclusion department should have an action plan for each year. And sometimes these action plans are rolling, so they may go over the course of 2 to 3 years, depending on how big the action plan is. The action plan should reflect the purpose of whatever your actions are, how it will be done, the time scale, who is going to lead on it, and what does success look like for each of those actions. So thinking about the impact of all of the actions you're going to have and how are you going to measure that impact. So always remember it should be measurable. If you can't measure it, it shouldn't really be in there. It has to be measurable. A really useful tool for your action planning is to do a RAG rating. So if you're carrying your action plan over from the end of term last year to this term, RAG rating can help you to identify what has been completed successfully, what is still under process, and what needs to be actioned this year. So red means it's not done, amber means it's under process, and green means it's completed. And this is really vitally important. A tip would be to look to your school's action plan, so your school improvement plan or your school's action plan. Take the template that the school is using for that and use the same template for your inclusion action plan. Keeping everything on the same template helps it to be more readable for your SLT, and it saves you creating a template individually. It also helps when you're doing your inspection or whether you're doing board reviews, because everything is in a similar template and it just makes it more accessible for your whole team. Next, you need to do your SEF review. So include your SLT, talk to them about the existing SEF, update your data as of what was available last year, and in a month or so, once you start getting your inclusion register populated and all of that, you can update your data again and review all of your actions. So once you RAG rate your inclusion action plan, you can reflect that in the SEF. My advice is to keep your SEF as concise as possible. Don't spend hours and hours reviewing a SEF. The SEF, in my experience during inspection, is not dwelled upon. Very often as inspectors, we only look at the SEF for 30 to 40 minutes, if even that. So I would not spend that much time on it. Have very brief bullet points on there, and don't get caught up in really intricate data. Just think about what you want to be reflected and key points that you want to develop. And that's really important. So many practitioners in schools spend hours and hours on the SEF, and it's not, in my experience, it's not always valued that heavily during inspection. So use it as a point of reference rather than something that you spend so much time in. Okay, next is to review your regulatory portals. So this is most important for schools in Dubai and schools in Abu Dhabi, where there is a lot of information requested by the regulator. So the KHDA portal is quite detail heavy, as is ESIS, the ADEC portal. So it's important to get started on those early, fill in as much information on them as you can from the very start, because if you leave it go too late, you will find that you've hours and hours, perhaps days, and sometimes even weeks of work trying to catch up on filling in all of your student information, particularly ESIS, because there are lots and lots of bits and pieces of information that you need to complete. So it's really useful to get those started early. I know that inspections are scheduled to begin as soon as next week for different emirates. So it's important that we're on top of this as early as possible and to be ready. Okay, for inspection prep, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but it's always useful to know the different elements of the inspection that are relevant to inclusion. So inclusion is not just performance standard 5. When we look through the inspection framework, you will find that inclusion is reflected throughout. And I'm just trying, I think some of my slide is not opening. Here we go. So there are different elements across different performance standards that are relevant to inclusion. So for example, on performance standard 3.2 under assessment, that we have knowledge and support for all students learning. Okay, I've just missed a little bit, but the other performance standards that are relevant are under curriculum design, where it speaks to having designing your curriculum to meet the needs of all students. Under performance standard 6 for leadership, it speaks about creating an inclusive setting for all students also. Under progress, the performance standard for progress, it speaks about ensuring that the needs of all different learners are met. So inclusion is woven throughout each of the performance standards. So when you're doing your planning, it's worthwhile to note that, and it's important to know that when you're designing your set also. Okay, so the next section is ensuring that you have identification for your students and making sure that your teachers fully understand the different tiers of intervention. Different schools call the intervention process different things. So you have levels, you will have waves and tiers, but essentially they are all the same. So tier 1 is your mainstream class, where you have your teacher giving quality differentiated instruction, and they are separating the different groups according to their needs, but within the mainstream class. Tier 2, level 2 or wave 2 is where you have targeted interventions, where you may have a read-writing grouping, you may have a group of students who are gifted in math who are being seen to within the class. And then tier 3 are the tiers that are the most pertinent to inclusion, where you have intensive support. These are your students who will have generally a formal diagnosis from a center or a doctor. They will have an IEP, and they will be getting either one-to-one or small group interventions from the inclusion team. It's really important that all of your school, your teachers, your SLT, and your principals know exactly what your process is for referring a student. And as a head of inclusion, having a flow chart like this can save you hours and hours of time in terms of teachers wanting to know, what can they do? I've got a student in my class, she's really challenging, I don't understand her needs, how do I support her? When you have a really clearly defined process for identification and support, you will save hours and hours of your time talking each teacher through the process. So here we have a pretty standard inclusion or referral flow chart. And this flow chart can be used if you tweak it a little bit, it can be used for pretty much any school in the UAE because generally the procedures are pretty similar. So here we have one where the teacher identifies a student's needs. The first thing you need to do is quality first differentiated teaching. And you check, has that worked? Does the student make progress and are their needs being met in class? And that's tier one. So if that is a yes and the student's needs are being met, then you just continue with quality first differentiated progress or differentiated practice. If the student is not making progress and their needs have not been met within the class through differentiated teaching, that's when the teacher needs to engage the support of the inclusion department. And they would then create a referral. Now, the referral process will be unique to every school. Some schools do it through their student management system. So whether that is SIMS, ISAM, SECTA, whatever your student management system is, they make the referral through there, or some schools are doing referrals on paper forms. Some schools are doing it on a shared drive. Some schools are doing it on a Google Drive. Whatever way you do it, that's fine. But once there is a clearly defined referral process, so teachers know where they can go, it is advisable that you have a standard referral form, so that will help teachers to state exactly what their concerns are. Now, on a referral form, in my experience, it's really useful to have some key questions on there. So asking the teacher, do you think that the student's needs are predominantly academic? Perhaps their communication and language, sensory, and you can list out the most common areas of need or the most common barriers to learning that you see, and ask the teacher to try and identify that before you come and do an observation. As a head of inclusion, when you walk into a class, it's really useful to have an idea of what you're looking for, because we all know that students can look like one student on a Monday, and by Wednesday they can present as a completely different student. So if the teacher can give you a bit of guidance and advice as to what you're looking for, that would be really useful. I often share screeners with the teachers so that they can kind of pinpoint what exactly it is they're looking for. Really easy to use screeners so that the teacher, any teacher, can use them. A quick one so that they don't take up too much time, because we know teachers are very busy. If they've got a really lengthy screener to fill out, very often they won't fill it out. So we want something short and easy to access that will help them to advise us as the inclusion team as to what they think the child's area of need is. Once they've made their referral, then the inclusion team should be coming to do an observation. And then if the child's needs are profound or complex, do we need to engage an external agent like an occupational therapist or a speech and language therapist, and then engaging the parents every step of the way before we come together to write, where necessary, to write up an IEP. So this kind of flow chart can be really useful. I usually ask schools to print this off and place it in the classrooms so that the teacher always has it to hand and they know exactly where to go. A useful thing to do is to hyperlink on your flow chart where they can access different documents, like where do I access the IEP template, hyperlink it to that. Where do I access the referral? So if you've got a referral through your student management system, hyperlink your flowchart to that management system, and it will save you lots and lots of time. Okay, it's also really useful as an inclusion lead to have an inclusion calendar set up for your academic year, clearly stating what you're going to do in September, November, January, and for each month, have a set of tasks that you need to do to remind you. So at any time of the year, you can open your inclusion calendar and say, okay, it's November. I need to close off our existing IEPs, have our parent progress meetings, update our data, and perhaps have a coffee morning or something, whatever you've got allocated for that month. As an inclusion practitioner, we have so much going on. It can be very easy to forget to do certain things at certain times of year. But if you set up your inclusion calendar and share it with everybody, everybody will know exactly what is happening at what time. And this can be a really, really useful tool, especially for your SLT or your principal, so that you can say, okay, let us set out together. Will we do a parent engagement morning in October? Will we do another one in April? Will we do an end of year gathering for our inclusion team, including our parents, our therapists who work with the school, so that everybody has a feeling of ownership and they feel that they have contributed to it. Okay, our next step then, once we've gotten to know our students and we've met with our teachers and we've allowed for a little settling in time, then we can look to setting up our SMART IEPs. And SMART, I hope everyone knows what SMART is: specific, measured, achievable, realistic, and timed are SMART goals. So I would always advise to wait at least 2 to 4 weeks before I would start writing IEPs, unless you have students who are returning and who you know very well. But the summer often changes our students. They often progress very, very in leaps and bounds, while some students will regress over the summer months. So it's important to give them a few weeks to settle into school, to get back into the flow of being in the educational context, and also to give our teachers time to get to know what their current barriers are. I would keep my IEP as simple as possible. My advice to schools always is try to keep it to a one-page IEP. I've worked with lots of schools where there are 6 to 12-page IEPs. I've recently worked with a school where they had a 20+ page IEP. That's over 20 pages of information on the IEP. In my experience, very few teachers will read all of that. The most impactful IEP is a very short, student-friendly IEP that everyone can access quickly. With a one-page IEP, I would advise that you have it very student-friendly, so it can double up as a reward chart for your student. I would use this as low as KG all the way through to year 12 or 13, and having these as a method of reward and tracking for your students. Students in KG can keep it in their folder, and they can stamp or draw a smiley face, or you can give them stickers whenever they've achieved their target. They may not be able to read it, but as long as they're aware of what their targets are, you as an inclusion teacher, if there's a shadow teacher or the class teacher, can remind them that they're working on those targets all the time. With older students, they themselves should be contributing to writing their IEP targets. What do they want to work on, and how do they think they can achieve it? Always, I would advise to have parental engagement in writing the targets. So one of the things that I would do as a head of inclusion, I used to invite our parents, our class teacher, any therapists who are working with the child, if they're available, and myself as the head of inclusion. bring all of those people together in a meeting, whether it's in Zoom or in person, face-to-face in the school. And I would ask everybody before the meeting to think of 3 goals that they want to work on. What 3 things do they want to achieve for the student? And then when you come together, you can cross-reference everybody's targets and find correlations where you can devise 3 targets that cover everybody's needs as best possible, and you can prioritize those needs so that the holistic approach is really valuable and it can cover all of the students' areas of need. So from day 1, I would start preparing the inclusion register and ensure that any students who are identified at registration, you can get all of their information in there, and then you can start adding to it for your tier 3 students, particularly as students' needs are being identified by teachers as the students get used to being in school and the teachers start seeing things more. I would set up progress records and your tracking sheets for all of your inclusion programs. So if you're running individual programs like Toe by Toe or Nessie or whatever programs you're using, set up your tracking records so that you'll be easily able to extract that data for yourself when it comes to completing your school documentation, for whether it's for inspection, for the regulator, or just for your own records to know where your students are. Don't forget your staff. If you're a head of inclusion or an inclusion lead, if you're a SEND teacher, if you're an LSA or a TA, all staff should have a clearly defined job description. This job description will outline what the expected tasks are for you every day. It should outline who you're reporting to, who your line manager is. It should outline any code of conduct, simple things like etiquette, appropriate dress for your setting, and what the safeguarding procedures are. So all of those should be noted in the job description. It's vitally important that all of your staff have police clearance as well. Some schools this will have been taken care of by the HR department, but it's important that if you have LSAs or individual LSAs, ILSAs or shadow teachers working in the inclusion team, especially those who are sourced by families and parents, they have to have police clearance. And as the head of inclusion, that falls under our remit to make sure that that police clearance is in place. It's important also to note that they have their PCR clearance. So depending on which emirate you're in, it will have to be within the time frame as governed by your regulator. It's really important also to make sure that everybody on your team has a schedule. And this might sound simple and a bit like duh, like Homer Simpson might say, but sometimes as a head of inclusion, we forget to share the schedules. So if you have an LSA, particularly a parent-employed LSA, don't forget to share the class timetable with them. Doing an induction with them, even if it's only 30 minutes, gather all of your shadow teachers together and just do an overview of things that we might take for granted, like what is the code of conduct? What are the class timings? Where is the staff room? Where are the toilets? What do I do if there's an emergency? Share all the policies with them. Where do I have lunch? Am I allowed to use my phone? Things like that, so that everybody knows exactly what they should be doing and what their expectations are. For your TAs and your LSAs, it's important that they understand what the expectations are for tracking and monitoring, Are they expected to give a daily review or a weekly review? Do they have specific progress trackers that they are expected to fill out? So make sure that everybody knows what the expectation is. Okay, and some questions that you should ask your team. Do you feel clear about your role? Now, this is a really valuable question. Sometimes as a head of inclusion, even we don't know what exactly is our role. Our role can be so diverse and so mixed and stratified that it's difficult to pin it down. But as an inclusion leader, particularly, if you are managing a team, it's very important that you help your team to understand what their role is. So, for example, is a shadow teacher expected to toilet the children in the class? Is a shadow teacher expected to take small groups in the class? And those can be yes or no answers depending on your setting. It's important to ask your team as well, are you monitoring your own success? So what do you see as being a successful achievement of your role within the school this year? How can we help you to get there? It's valuable to ask them as well what CPD or continuous professional development they would like to have in the school year and how can you support it. I know a lot of schools have very limited budgets for CPD, but there's lots and lots of freely accessible professional development out there. I know, for example, there's an LSA forum that's run by my partner, Harmeet, under Inclusion, and we share that widely. That's all free and accessible. The Open University in the UK, they have loads of free courses that you get certificates for. Khan Academy have loads of free courses that are really, really good as well. And they get certificates for those as well. Then I would ask them also, what would you change about your role? Because sometimes you may have practitioners who are really strong in certain areas, but haven't had the chance to express those skills. So it's really valuable to ask your team, what are your strengths and what would you like to change so that we can build on those strengths more? And that also gives your team a sense of belonging and a sense of empowerment when you ask them those kind of questions. Okay, so I know that was loads to consider and loads to take into consideration or to take under advisement for the start of the year. But I'm just looking at the chat now and I'm seeing some questions. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat or equally just speak out. You're welcome to talk and ask me any questions you may have. Anybody? Okay, I'm seeing Catherine. What about the new framework? Nigel, right. This is a whole standard 7 for inclusion. Yes, so Nigel, yes, the new framework is available and it was shared openly by the MOE, the Ministry of Education, and they asked for peer review. So we all got to see it. So it's available, I believe it's still available on the MOE website, but it hasn't been ratified yet. So while it's been under peer review and it's been essentially cleared by the regulators, it hasn't been ratified. So the advice going out to schools at the moment is to devise their SEF based on the existing framework. But we're hoping that they will, and the advice going to the inspectors is also using the existing framework. We're hoping that that new framework will be ratified soon because there are actually 2 standards relating to inclusion. There's a whole standard for well-being, and there's also the standard 7 for inclusive practice, which is 3 tiers to that standard. One is engagement for parents, one is about supporting your students' needs, and the third one escapes me, but they're all generally in and around inclusive practice. And that's really good for us because it will help us to get inclusion front and fore for our SLT and for our teachers. Also the flow chart. Oh, it's a bit blurry. I can share the flow chart with you. If you pop me an email on info@incluzun.com, I can share a sample of the flow chart with you. Now, Rachel, how many targets should we have on IEPs? And does every SEND pupil need one? If they don't have an IEP, what should they have? I'm new to Dubai, so I am using EHCPs. So an EHCP is from the UK. They're the education healthcare plans. So an IEP, generally, research shows that between 3 and 5 targets is the optimal. I would say try to use 3 meaningful targets would be my advice, but anywhere between 3 and 5 targets. The IEP is very similar to the EHCP. You have your 3 SMART targets. You have things to do in school, things to do at home, so the parents can support at home. And you need to have very clearly defined success criteria on there as well. And the IEP should be shared with your class teacher, with your parents, your student where appropriate, with your SLT, anyone who's working with that child. The difference between the EHCP, it's much less detailed. You don't need to have every bit of information about the student's personal data doesn't have to be on there. I would always include the student's academic, current academic results on there as well. So if you're doing a CAT4, GL assessments, PAT assessments, NGRT, whatever it is that you're using, have those academic scores on there as well, so that you can see where they are academically and what they're working on in terms of the IEP. The IEP targets should always be barrier focused. That's a really key thing to remember. It should not necessarily be purely academic. What you're looking for on an IEP is what is stopping the student from learning in the same way that all the other students are learning. What is their barrier to learning? So if that's dyslexia, the barrier may be, for example, that they cannot access the board, what's written on the board accurately, or they may not be able to access writing. So you're tackling that barrier by providing, for example, colored overlays or reading windows. That's the barrier. So you're not looking at the academics, you're looking at the barriers. Can you also talk about the IEP tracking? So to collect IEP data, this is quite a broad, Uzma, it's quite a broad topic that probably would need an hour of discussion on its own. But I would advise that you use the IEP as a living document, actively used every day. At the end of each 4 to 6 week period, or at the end of each term, depending on how long your IEP is ongoing for, I would capture your data by what percentage of the targets have been met. And you can measure that by working toward meeting or exceeding, or whatever process your school is using. I would always advise that you try to use the same measuring tools that the school is using. So if your school is using working toward meeting, exceeding, or if they're using something else like on track, beyond, or not yet achieved, use the same terminology and the same method of measurement so that you're presenting your information all in the one language. So when you're using your data for yourself, it's all written in the same language. Okay, Laura, any recommendations related to students with behavioral challenges? Now, we're going to do a whole forum on managing challenging behavior, probably either next month or the month after, because this is by far the most common area that we're hearing at the moment. But remember also, in the first couple of weeks of term, students will be really challenged because they're moving from a summer of being free and unstructured to being back in a school. So give them a few weeks before you start thinking about tackling specific behaviors. Give them a couple of weeks to settle. If the behaviors, negative behaviors persist, then look at implementing an individual behavior plan. But I wouldn't jump in with a behavior plan ever until you've got about 2 weeks of settling in period minimum. Okay, Usma, can you also make Send Teachers platform to share ideas and resources? So we have, this platform is covering SENCO's Heads of Inclusion and Send Teachers, and Mita has a forum, my partner has a forum for learning support practitioners that happens on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. So tomorrow at 5 p.m. she will have that forum. And if you look on our media pages like LinkedIn, for example, we will post all of the updates there. I'm just adding our media handles now. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll find the links to those forums as well. Okay, Rachel, how about co-teaching? As the topic has been highlighted a lot recently in, should every SEND pupil have an IEP? Oh yeah, so, okay, to answer the first question, co-teaching, I would highly advise co-teaching as a really good method of supporting students. Working with your class teacher to deliver a session where both are working in tandem with shared planning is really, really effective, and it can be really good fun. I used to love co-teaching. I used to love doing shared team teaching in class. It shares the load. If you've got two teachers who work really well together, it can be really enjoyable for both the students and for the teachers. And for IEPs, this depends on your workload. If you have got a big team who can write IEPs for all of your tier 3 and tier 2, I would. If you've got limited capacity, I would focus on tier 3. So all tier 3 students should have an IEP. That's definite. Tier 2 students depends on your capacity. So if you have enough people who can write the IEPs and implement them, then I would write them for your tier 2s as well. Tier 1s necessarily don't need an IEP. However, if you've got specific needs where you think it would be useful, then it's up to you to decide. And Laura, any special tools you would recommend for assessing students? So if you have somebody who is CSEP qualified in the school, I would recommend your psychometrics like the Wyatt, the WISC, the Wenshell, BPVS, which is British Picture Sight Vocabulary Scale. It's a really good one for getting to know the child's vocabulary, and also is a good indicator of their grasp of the English language. The Sandwell and SNAP, those kind of things for formal assessments, your psychometrics. If you don't have a CSET qualified practitioner, a CSET is the Certificate for Child Educational Testing. If you don't have CSET, then I would advise using checklists, any kind of checklists that you have. And Incluzun have a set of checklists that we can share with you. If you pop us an email, again, pop us an email and we can talk to you about that. Can you send us the transcript? Sawson, this is a good question. Let me check on Zoom. I haven't been asked for this before, so I'll check on Zoom if I can download the transcript and share it. And the tracking tools, again, this is going to be a whole, that'll be a whole session that we can do on tracking tools. I did one last year. Actually, yes, there's a video on YouTube of the tracking tools. So if you go to the YouTube page, I've shared the link here. All of the videos of last year's forums, and I did a full forum on tracking and data management, so you'll find that there. Okay, everyone, well, thank you very much for coming today. As always, it is an absolute pleasure, and I hope it has been helpful. If any of you have a really good idea or would like to present on the forum with me, we're always looking to have people co-host and co-present. So please let me know. Pop me a message on LinkedIn or on WhatsApp and let me know if you've got some tools or strategies that you would like to share. And please do share with any other practitioners about the forum, because we can all learn from each other. Have a lovely day or afternoon, and I hope that you have a very successful year ahead. And I look forward to our upcoming forums. Thanks everyone and have a good day. Take care. Ma salama.